There's never just one way to paint something. And that also applies to purity seals.
Actually, yes there is.
It all depends how you did the rest of your miniature. This ranges from the temperature of your base colors used, over light source placement, or mood of the surrounding light you are using to tell the bigger story. Also, it's going to be influenced on whether or not you use saturated or desaturated colors, or warm and cool colors. So let me start this tutorial by talking about base colors for a purity seal. I found a great base color that I'm constantly using for my purity seals and anything that resembles parchment, and that is English Uniform. You can start with a pure color or mix it brighter, and of course you can also mix it darker. But of course you don't need to use this exact color that I'm mentioning. Literally any beige brown you fancy will do here, because we can always adjust the tone of a color at any time during the painting process, and we are going to see that in a few minutes. I'm starting by applying a consistent layer of English Uniform. That's dark enough for me right now, as I will apply some shading later. Of course you can add some black to start darker or desaturate the color right here. It's all up to you. When you choose what color you want to use for your purity seals, remember to make a conscious decision. Don't just slap anything on there. When your miniature is predominantly painted in desaturated and dull colors, you probably want the purity seal to look similar, so they don't stand out too much. Of course, it could be a design choice to do exactly that, then maybe you want to indicate a certain glow and power behind the seals. Another example would be that if you have cool shadows all over the miniature and then you use a warm color for your purity seal shades, that can look irritating. So think about it, whether or not your color choice works with the rest before you begin. Again, you have a lot of highlight options. Keep in mind what we said, make a conscious choice. I'm using ice yellow because it fits the mood of the rest of the model and it gives a credible parchment color. I mix the colors in a ratio of about 50-50, maybe a bit more English Uniform to be on the safe side. Then I'm testing the dilution and I want the transparency somewhere between a layer and a glaze. Using parallel strokes with the broad side of the tip of the brush, I'm applying a first layer. Notice how the darker color is still shining through. Now to make the initial gradient stronger, I'm applying a second layer of paint with the same transparency and I'm covering less area, creating a highlight towards the side as that part lies on top of the knee armor and will catch more light. I'm adding more ice yellow for the next layer and I'm using the same transparency to add the next layers, gently pushing the pigments toward the highlight. At this stage I start to put sharp highlights on the edges to frame the parchment. Using the same glazing technique, I make the lower part of the parchment brighter where it bends back up and leave a shadow below the sharper edge. I'm repeating this step another time with an even lighter mix, as always testing the transparency on my thumb and then applying the paint. I'm aligning the strokes horizontally, so if any of them show, they show as part of the structure of the parchment fabric. Always be conscious about your brush strokes and what directions they have and how they influence the results. At this point I'm also bringing the second piece of scroll that is partly covered by the one in the front up to the same stage. Using pure ice yellow, I'm adding bright highlights to the edges, but then I realized I also wanted another highlight on the parchment. Just gentle and white brush strokes, utilizing the transparency of the layers. I wanted one more hint of a highlight, so I used an off-white to emphasize the features that would catch more light, like tears and edges. Also the lower part here that bends up, and the upper edge on the side here gets additional attention. Using this color, I also add additional structure by painting horizontal lines here and there again. That's the result for now. Smooth transitions, subtle shadow and light variations as they would be influenced by the structures below. Optionally, we can add a bit of richness through washes. It doesn't necessarily have to be washes, but there's some interesting sepia tones available among them, which work nicely with parchment. Whenever I work with washes, I like to add a bit of dish soap, which breaks the surface tension and makes the washes cover more evenly, as you can see when I add it to the Raycon flesh and the sepia on the palette. Why not use a flow improver? That's easy to answer. You need the tiniest amount of dish soap to break the surface tension, and it doesn't influence the properties of the shades too much. With a glazing consistency, I'm adding subtle color shifts along the gradient, and I make sure the pigment pools in the darker area. We want to reinforce our initial painting here and not work against it. And you can see how the area gets richer and more nuanced instantly. Then I'm adding sepia to darken the whole area a bit more, and also to darkline the individual parts for better readability. I decided to go darker with the washes because the overall shadows on the rest of the miniature are desaturated, so I wanted to also do that on the parchment. So I glazed on a few more layers, emphasizing the shadows mostly. Doing some cleanup on the lower parts, starting with the edges. You have to realize that using a bright color over a very dark one, especially with a lot of black in it, turns the result slightly gray. Because we have pre-mixed colors, and a very bright one is going to have a lot of white in it, and a dark one, obviously, even if it's a brown, is going to have a lot of black. And when you mix white and black, then you get gray, even if the colors are perceived differently. That's why you always want to shade and highlight a mid-tone, and you don't want to go from a very dark color up to the brightest color, because anything in between where you mess up is just going to look weird. Also, glazing thin layers of a bright color over a dark color is going to look gray because of the way they interact and how the dark color shines through the bright color. Here the graying doesn't matter so much because this part is supposed to be desaturated anyway, as all my shadows are desaturated. And this kind of was the theme of the miniature. On a few edges I added a bit of off-white highlights to have a maximum of contrast. And you can see that I switched to stippling for some of it to add additional texture. And I also drew a single line where the parchment looked slightly torn. For the scribbling, I'm using a mix of black and rhinoxide. That's because using pure black for this usually looks weird, so don't use it, just trust me on it. Before I put the brush to mini, I test both the colors and the consistency. You want the brush to leave a super thin and even stroke, and then I also test exactly the size I want to do my writing at to get into the groove. What I do for the line work is a minimal vertical movement as I draw the line to simulate the inconsistencies of words. And I also disrupt the line in an irregular way to give the impression of separate words. I'm drawing regular distance lines to a certain point, which is where I want some variety, and I draw a stylized imperial eagle there. It's interesting how just a few brush strokes will communicate exactly what we want the viewer to see here. After that, I fill up the empty space around the eagle and continue further down. For the base color of the wax seal, I'm using a medium red, like Mephiston red for example, and mix it with black. I do this so I don't have to apply shade color after the midtone. This is definitely more controlled than applying a wash. I'm painting the midtones with pure Mephiston red. And because I'm lazy, I use the ice yellow that I already had on the palette to mix a highlight color and just touch the higher up areas of the wax. I do this to mimic light reflecting on a glossy surface. And this is the result. Before I let you go, maybe consider helping me out by following my Instagram page. I'm posting regular updates there, and I will also do 1 or 2 of these mini step-by-step guides for every miniature I paint. Just make sure it's a conscious decision. For the scribbling, and I also disrupt the line in an irregular